He didn't lose everything all at once. It just felt like it. Like his life had been quietly cracking for months and then suddenly shattered in one loud, unforgiving moment. Because 1 week ago, he still had a job people respected, a fiancé people admired, and a future that looked clean and certain, and now he had none of it. Just a phone full of unanswered messages, a reputation he couldn't fix, and a silence that followed him everywhere he went. The kind of silence that makes you feel like the world has already moved on without you. And that was how he found himself driving through unfamiliar roads with no real destination. Just trying to get away from everything that reminded him of who he used to be. The city lights fading behind him, the noise replaced by the low hum of the engine and his own thoughts. Thoughts he couldn't escape no matter how far he drove, until eventually even the car felt too small for everything he was carrying. So when he saw the sign for a bed and breakfast tucked away on a quiet street, he didn't overthink it. He didn't check reviews or compare options. He just turned the wheel and stopped, because at that point he wasn't looking for something perfect. He was just looking for somewhere that didn't feel like a reminder of failure. The place looked simple, almost too simple, with warm lights glowing through the windows and snow beginning to settle along the edges of the roof. The kind of place people go to rest, not to hide, and he almost drove away because something about it felt too calm for the storm inside him. But the cold air hit him the moment he stepped out of the car, sharp and immediate, forcing him to move, forcing him to knock. And when the door opened, he didn't see judgment. He didn't see curiosity. He just saw her, standing there in soft light, looking at him like he was just another guest and not a man who had just lost everything. And that alone caught him off guard, because he had gotten used to people looking at him differently, like they were measuring him against the rumors they had already heard. But she didn't do that. She simply stepped aside and said he should come in before he froze, her voice calm, steady, like she had said those words 100 times before. And maybe she had, but to him it felt like something else, something he hadn't felt in days, maybe even longer. And inside, the place was warm in a way that went beyond temperature. It smelled like fresh bread and something sweet he couldn't name. The kind of smell that makes you feel like you've stepped into a memory you don't even remember having. And for a moment, he just stood there, unsure of what to do next, because slowing down felt unfamiliar now. Like his body didn't know how to exist without pressure, without urgency. But she didn't rush him, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary questions. She just asked how long he planned to stay, and he said one night without thinking, because that was all he allowed himself to want. One night to rest, one night to breathe, one night to not think about what came next. And she nodded like that made perfect sense, handed him a key and showed him to a room upstairs that was simple but quiet, with a bed that looked too soft for someone like him. Like it belonged to a life that didn't include stress or loss. And when she left, Sutter closing the door gently behind her, the silence returned. But this time it felt different, not heavy, not suffocating, just still. And he sat on the edge of the bed staring at nothing, his mind replaying everything he had tried to outrun. The meeting where it all fell apart, the look on his fiancée's face when she walked away, the messages he never responded to because he didn't know how to explain something. He barely understood himself, and for a moment he thought about leaving, about getting back in the car and continuing to drive until he felt something again. Anything other than this strange calm. But before he could act on it, there was a soft knock on the door, and when he opened it, she was standing there holding a cup of tea, saying she thought he might need something warm. And it was such a small gesture. So simple, it almost didn't make sense. But somehow it hit deeper than anything else had that day. Because it wasn't about fixing anything. It wasn't about asking questions or offering solutions. It was just kindness, quiet and unforced. And he took the cup without saying much. But something inside him shifted, just a little, like a door that had been stuck finally loosening. And that night, for the first time in what felt like forever, he slept. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but enough to forget for a few hours. And when morning came, he expected the weight to return immediately, But instead there was something else, something softer, something that made him pause before rushing out the door like he had planned. Because downstairs he could hear movement, the sound of dishes, the quiet rhythm of someone going about their day. And without fully understanding why, he found himself following that sound, stepping into the dining area where she was setting the table, sunlight filtering through the windows. The world outside still cold, but the inside steady and warm. And when she looked up and saw him, she smiled, not in a way that demanded anything from him, just a simple acknowledgement that he was there. And she asked if he wanted breakfast, like it was the most normal question in the world. And he realized in that moment that no one had asked him something that simple in a long time, something that didn't come with expectations or pressure. And instead of saying no like he usually would, instead of keeping his distance, he said yes and sat down. And as he ate slowly, quietly, he felt something unfamiliar begin to settle inside him. Not happiness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it, or at least the absence of everything that had been weighing him down. And when he finished, he told himself again that he would leave after this, that this was just a stop, not a place to stay. But as he looked around at the quiet, at her moving through the space like it was home, at the way nothing here demanded anything from him, he hesitated just for a second, just long enough for a thought to slip in that he hadn't expected. What if one more night wouldn't hurt? What if he wasn't ready to go back yet? And that thought stayed with him longer than it should have, following him as he stood up, as he walked back to his room, as he looked at his suitcase still half unpacked, like a decision waiting to be made. And for the first time since everything fell apart, he didn't know what the right move was anymore, because leaving felt familiar but heavy, and staying felt uncertain but strangely light. And somewhere deep down, a quiet voice he had been ignoring started to speak again, telling him that maybe running wasn't the answer this time. Maybe stopping was, but he wasn't ready to admit that yet. Not fully, not out loud, because if he stayed, even for one more night, it would mean accepting that something about this place, about her, had already begun to matter more than it should, and that scared him more than losing everything ever did. Because this time, if he let himself feel something again, he knew there would be something to lose all over again. And as he stood there holding the key in his hand, staring at the door like it held the answer, he didn't realize that this small, simple decision, so now one more night or leave now, was about to change everything in a way he could never undo. And he had no idea that the woman downstairs, who had asked him no questions and offered him nothing but quiet kindness, was about to become the reason he would forget how to leave it all. But for now, he was still standing there, caught between who he was and who he was becoming, and the only question left was, would he walk away while it was still easy, or stay long enough for it to become impossible? He told himself it was just one more night, nothing more than a pause before he figured things out, just a small delay before returning to the life he had left behind. But even as he said it in his head, something about it didn't feel true, because when he walked downstairs that morning and told her he wanted to stay another night, the words came too easily, like they had already been decided somewhere deeper inside him, and she didn't react in any dramatic way. She didn't question him or look surprised. She just nodded gently and said she would prepare the room, as if people extending their stay without explanation was something she understood more than most. And that calm acceptance made it easier for him to stay, easier than it should have been, because there was no pressure, no attention drawn to his decision, just space. And for the first time in a long time, space felt safe instead of lonely. And so the second day began quietly, with no plans and no expectations, something he wasn't used to, because his life before had always been scheduled, structured, every hour accounted for, every move calculated. But here, time moved differently, slower, softer. And at first it made him restless. He didn't know what to do with himself without deadlines or responsibilities, so he paced his room, checked his phone, even though there was nothing new he wanted to see, stared out the window at the snow-covered street, like he was waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. And that nothing slowly started to feel like something. Something calm, something steady, something he didn't realize he had been missing. And eventually, he found himself going downstairs again. Not because he needed anything, but because being alone in his room felt heavier than being around her quiet presence. And she was there, as always, moving through the space with a kind of ease he couldn't understand yet, wiping down tables, arranging small details like they mattered. And when she noticed him, she simply asked if he wanted coffee, and he said yes. And that was how it started, not with big conversations or sudden connections, but with small moments repeated quietly, building something neither of them named. And as the day went on, he stayed close, sitting in the corner, watching the way the place worked, the way she greeted guests, the way she made everything feel simple even when it probably wasn't. And at some point, without thinking, he offered to help. Maybe out of habit. Maybe because he didn't know how to just exist without being useful. And she hesitated for a second, like she was measuring whether he meant it, and then she handed him a small task. Nothing complicated, just something to do, and he did it. And for a moment it felt normal, like a piece of his old life returning. What but without the pressure that used to come with it, and that feeling stayed with him longer than expected. And the next day, he stayed again. And this time, he didn't even need to convince himself. It just felt natural, like leaving would have been the strange choice, not staying. And the days began to blend into each other in the best way. Slow mornings, quiet afternoons, soft evenings where they would sit and talk just enough to learn something new about each other without ever feeling like they were digging too deep. And he started to notice things about her, the way she always checked the windows before it got dark, the way she paused for a second before answering certain questions, like she was choosing her words carefully, the way she seemed completely at peace and yet carried something unspoken beneath it all. And it made him curious, but not in a way that pushed him to ask, more in a way that made him want to stay long enough to understand. And in return, she noticed things about him too. Even the things he tried to hide, like how he avoided certain topics, how he stared at his phone longer than necessary before putting it down, how sometimes he looked like he was about to say something and then chose silence instead. But she never forced it out of him. She just made space for it. And that space became something he relied on more than he wanted to admit. And one evening, as the snow fell heavier than it had all week, covering the outside world completely, they found themselves sitting closer than usual, the quiet between them more comfortable now, less like distance and more like understanding. And for the first time, he told her a little more about what had happened, not everything, not the full story, but enough to explain why he had needed to disappear for a while. And she listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without judging, just present. And when he finished, she didn't offer advice or try to fix anything. She just said that sometimes losing everything is the only way people realize what they never needed in the first place. And those words stayed with him because no one had ever said something like that to him before. Not in a way that felt true. And that night, as he went back to his room, he realized something had changed. Not around him, but inside him, because the urge to run was fading, slowly, quietly, replaced by something else. Something that felt unfamiliar but right. And the next morning, he didn't even think about leaving. He just woke up and went downstairs like he belonged there. Like this had become his routine, and that realization should have scared him more than it did, because it meant he was getting comfortable, too comfortable, in a place that was never meant to be permanent. But instead of pulling away, he leaned into it, telling himself he would figure it out later, that there was no rush, that one more day wouldn't change anything. But deep down, something else was happening, something he wasn't ready to name yet. Because staying was no longer about avoiding his past. It was starting to feel like moving towards something new, and that shift was dangerous because it meant there was now something to lose again. And as the days passed and winter settled deeper around them, the outside world growing quieter, someone more distant, he didn't notice how far he had drifted from the life he used to know, how the messages on his phone stopped bothering him, How the idea of going back started to feel less like a goal and more like a question. Until one afternoon, without warning, that question turned into something real. Because a message finally came through that he couldn't ignore. A name he hadn't seen in days. One that carried everything he had been trying not to think about. And as he stared at the screen, his chest tightening, the quiet life he had started to build inside those walls suddenly felt fragile, like it could disappear just as quickly as it had begun. And for the first time since he arrived, he felt that old pressure creeping back in, reminding him that he couldn't stay hidden forever, that eventually, sooner he would have to face everything he left behind. And the worst part wasn't the message itself, it was the realization that he didn't know if he wanted to go back anymore. And that scared him more than anything else, because it meant that staying here, with her, in this quiet, simple life, was no longer just a temporary escape. It was becoming something real, something that could change the direction of his entire future. And as he stood there holding his phone, caught between two lives that no longer felt equal, he realized that the choice he had been avoiding was slowly finding its way to him, whether he was ready or not. And the only question now was, what would he do when the past finally came knocking at the door he wasn't ready to open? The message stayed on his phone longer than it should have, somewhere not because he didn't understand what it meant, but because he didn't know what to do with it. And for the first time since he arrived, the quiet that once felt safe began to feel fragile, like it could break if he moved too quickly or thought too deeply. So he didn't answer it, not right away. He just slipped the phone back into his pocket and tried to continue the day as if nothing had changed. But something had, and he could feel it in the way his thoughts kept drifting, in the way his chest felt tighter, even in the warm comfort of the house. And she noticed, not in a direct way, not by asking what was wrong, but in the way she gave him a little more space than usual, in the way her eyes lingered on him just a second longer before looking away, like she understood that something had shifted without needing him to explain it. And that understanding made it harder for him to pretend everything was fine, because with most people, pretending was easy. But with her, it felt unnecessary, almost impossible. And that scared him in a different way, because it meant he was starting to trust her more than he had planned to, more than he thought he would allow himself to. And trust for him had never come without risk. And yet, as the day moved slowly forward, he found himself drawn to her again. Not because he needed distraction, but because being near her made the noise in his head quieter. Even now, even with the message sitting unanswered in his pocket. And that evening, as the light outside faded into a soft blue and the snow continued to fall, they ended up in the kitchen together, not by plan, just by habit, moving around each other in a way that felt natural. Like they had done it many times before, and for a while they didn't speak, just the sound of small tasks, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the room, until finally, without looking at her, he said that he had been avoiding something, and the words felt heavier than he expected, like they had been waiting for a chance to come out, and she didn't rush him, didn't turn it into a big moment. She just kept what she was doing and said that avoiding things can feel easier until it doesn't. And that simple response opened something in him, because it wasn't advice, it wasn't pressure, it was just truth. And slowly, carefully, he began to share more than he had before. Not just what had happened, but how it felt, the betrayal, the confusion, the way everything he thought was solid had fallen apart without warning. And as he spoke, he realized he wasn't just telling her the story, he was finally allowing himself to feel it fully, without rushing past it, without trying to fix it. And she listened the way she always did, steady, present, never interrupting. And when he finished, there was a quiet pause that didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something important had just settled between them. And then she told him something about herself, something she hadn't shared before. About a time when she had stayed too long in a life that didn't feel right because she was afraid of starting over, afraid of losing what she had built, even though it no longer made her happy, and how walking away had been the hardest thing she ever did. Not because she didn't know it was right, but because she didn't trust herself to rebuild something better. And as he listened, he saw her differently, not just as someone calm and steady, but as someone who had also been broken in her own way and had chosen to heal instead of hide. And that made him feel less alone in a way he couldn't explain. And something shifted again, deeper this time, because their connection was no longer built on small moments and quiet routines. It was built on truth, shared carefully, piece by piece. And that kind of connection doesn't stay light for long. It grows, it deepens, it changes the way people see each other and the way they see themselves. And over the next few days, that change became more visible in the way they looked at each other a little longer, in the way their conversations carried more meaning, even when they were about simple things. So in the way silence between them no longer felt like distance, but like something they both understood without needing to explain. And he began to realize that what he was feeling wasn't just comfort anymore. It was something more, something he hadn't expected to find here, something he hadn't even been looking for. And that realization brought both warmth and fear, because the more real it became, the more he understood what it could cost him. And one afternoon, as they walked outside together, clearing snow from the front path, the air cold but the moment steady, their hands brushed accidentally and neither of them pulled away immediately. Not because it was planned, but because it felt natural, like something that had already happened in every way except physically. And when they finally stepped back, there was a quiet awareness between them, something unspoken but undeniable. And from that moment on, everything felt slightly different, like a line had been crossed without either of them deciding to cross it. And that night, he couldn't ignore it anymore. The feeling, the connection, the way she had slowly become the center of his days without him even noticing. And for the first time since he arrived, the question wasn't just about staying or leaving. It was about what this meant, what they meant, and whether he was ready to let it become something real. Because once it did, there would be no going back to just being a guest passing through. And as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the message still unanswered, the past still waiting, and the present pulling him in a direction he hadn't planned for. He realized that he was standing at the edge of something that could either heal him or break him all over again. And the most dangerous part was that he was starting to want it anyway. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, a thought settled into his mind that he couldn't ignore anymore. What if the reason he couldn't leave wasn't just because he needed time, but because he was already falling for her? And if that was true, then the real question wasn't whether he would stay or go, but what would happen when she finally realized just how much of his heart was no longer his to protect. The feeling didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, quietly, until it became something he could no longer ignore. And once he admitted to himself that he was falling for her, everything around him seemed to shift. The small moments felt heavier. The silences felt deeper. And even the simplest interactions carried a weight that hadn't been there before. And that scared him, because it meant he was no longer just passing through her life. He was becoming part of it, and she was becoming part of his, in a way that could not be undone. And for a few days he tried to act the same, to keep things as they were, because there was safety in what they had built so far, a quiet understanding that didn't demand anything more than presence. But feelings don't stay hidden forever. They find their way into the smallest details, into the way you look at someone, into the way your voice softens without you noticing, into the way your world begins to revolve around moments you once thought were ordinary. And she began to notice those changes too, not all at once, but in pieces, like something slowly coming into focus. And instead of pulling away, she leaned into it in her own quiet way, allowing the connection to grow without rushing it, without forcing it into something it wasn't ready to be. And that made it even more real because there was no pressure, no expectations, just two people moving closer without needing to define it yet. And for a while that felt enough, more than enough, until the past he had been avoiding found a way back in, louder this time, harder to ignore, because the message he had left unanswered turned into a call, and then another, and then a name appearing again and again on his screen. a reminder that the life he had stepped away from was still there, still waiting, still demanding answers he hadn't given. And this time, he couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. So I couldn't push it aside and focus only on what was in front of him, because the past has a way of making itself heard when you try to silence it. And one evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the living room, the phone rang again, breaking the calm that had become so familiar. And for a moment he froze, caught between ignoring it and facing it. And she saw it, the hesitation, the tension in his expression, the way his hand tightened slightly around the phone. And instead of looking away, she asked gently if he was going to answer it. And that simple question felt heavier than anything else she could have said, because it forced him to confront what he had been avoiding. And after a long pause, he finally did, stepping outside into the cold air, closing the door behind him like he was trying to keep the two parts of his life separate. And the conversation that followed wasn't long, but it was enough to bring everything back to the surface. The expectations, the responsibilities, the unfinished business he had left behind. And when he came back inside, something about him had changed, not dramatically, but enough for her to feel it, like a shift in the air that couldn't be explained, but couldn't be ignored either. And for the first time since he arrived, there was distance between them. Not because they wanted it, but because something had come between them that neither of them knew how to handle yet. And the rest of the night passed quietly, but it was a different kind of quiet, one that carried questions instead of comfort, one that made everything feel uncertain again. And later, when they finally spoke about it, it wasn't easy, because the truth rarely is. He told her that his old life wasn't as finished as he had made it seem, that there were still ties, still things he had to face, and she listened. But this time, her silence felt different, not distant, but careful, like she was trying to understand what it meant for them without jumping to conclusions. And when she finally spoke, she didn't ask him to choose, didn't demand clarity. She just said that running away doesn't make things disappear. It only delays them, and that whatever he had left behind would eventually catch up to him. And he knew she was right, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. And that was the moment the conflict truly began. Not between them, but inside him. Because now he wasn't just choosing between staying and leaving. He was choosing between the life he had built and the life he had found, between the past that still held pieces of him and the present that was slowly becoming his future. And for the next few days, that conflict followed him everywhere. In the way he moved, in the way he spoke, in the way he looked at her, like he was trying to hold on to something that might slip away. And she felt it too. The tension, the uncertainty, the unspoken questions hanging between them. And even though they continued their routines, continued their conversations, something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. And one night, as the snow began to melt slightly for the first time, signaling that winter wouldn't last forever, they found themselves standing outside. Solar, the air colder than it looked, the silence heavier than before, and without planning it, without preparing for it, he reached for her hand, not casually this time, not by accident, but intentionally, like he was trying to hold on to something real in the middle of everything uncertain. And she didn't pull away, but she didn't fully hold on either. And that hesitation, small as it was, said more than words ever could, because it revealed the truth they had both been avoiding, that what they were building was no longer simple, no longer safe, and that sooner or later they would have to face what it meant. And as they stood there, neither of them speaking, both feeling the weight of everything that had changed, he realized that this was no longer just about his feelings. It was about hers too. Her, and about whether she was willing to risk what she had built for something that might not last. And that thought stayed with him long after they went back inside, long after the lights were turned off, long after the house fell quiet again, because for the first time since he arrived, he wasn't sure if staying was enough anymore. Not without answers, not without clarity. And as he lay awake, staring into the dark, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would force them both to decide what this really was. and whether it was strong enough to survive what came next. And the only thing he knew for sure was that whatever happened, nothing would ever go back to the way it was before, because now there was too much at stake, too much felt, too much shared. And as that realization settled in, heavy and unavoidable, one question began to rise above all the others. When the moment finally came to choose between the life he left behind and the one he was building with her, would he be strong enough to stay, or would the past pull him back before he even had the chance to try? The days after that night didn't fall apart, not in any obvious way, but something quiet had changed between them. Like a thin layer of distance neither of them had asked for, but both of them could feel, and they moved around it carefully, continuing their routines, speaking gently, avoiding anything that might push too hard against the fragile balance they were trying to hold on to. And for a while, it worked, at least on the surface. But underneath, the questions were growing, especially in him, because now that the past had found its way back in, he couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't stay suspended between two lives without eventually choosing one. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the answer wasn't as simple as he wanted it to be. Because leaving meant going back to something familiar but broken, something that had already hurt him. And staying meant risking something new, something uncertain, something that could either heal him or hurt him even more. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which was more dangerous. And while he was caught in that quiet struggle, she was carrying something of her own, something she had not yet shared, something that had been there long before he arrived but had stayed hidden beneath her calm, steady presence. And it began to show in small ways, ways that would have been easy to miss if he hadn't started paying closer attention to her. Like how she would pause when checking her phone and then quickly put it away. Like how she seemed distracted at certain times of the day. Like how there were moments when her calm felt more like effort than ease. And at first he told himself it was nothing, that everyone has things they don't talk about right away. But the more he noticed, the harder it became to ignore, especially because she had been so patient with him, so open in her own quiet way. And now it felt like there was a part of her he couldn't reach, a part she was keeping just out of sight. And that unsettled him more than he expected, because it made him realize that as much as he was afraid of losing her, he didn't actually know everything about her, and maybe she didn't know everything about him either. And that thought created a new kind of tension. Not sharp or loud, but steady and present, like something waiting to be uncovered. And it all came to the surface one afternoon, when he walked into the kitchen and found her standing still, her phone in her hand, her expression different from anything he had seen before. Not calm, not steady, but uncertain, almost conflicted. And when she noticed him, she quickly tried to return to herself, to that familiar calm he had come to rely on. But it didn't fully return, not this time. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them in a way that felt heavier than usual. Until finally he asked if everything was okay. And she hesitated, just long enough for him to know that the answer wasn't simple. And then she nodded, but it wasn't convincing. Not really. And instead of letting it go like he might have before, he stayed, standing there, waiting, not pushing, just present, the same way she had been for him so many times. And that presence made it harder for her to keep things hidden, because it reminded her of how much she had already shared, how much she had allowed him to see, and slowly, carefully, she told him that there were things about the place, about her life here, that weren't as settled as they seemed, that the bed and breakfast wasn't just a peaceful choice she had made. It was also something she was still fighting to keep, that there were financial pressures, decisions she had been avoiding, offers she hadn't responded to because she wasn't ready to let go of what she had built. And hearing that shifted something in him, because he had seen this place as solid, as safe, as something unchanging. And now he realized it was just as uncertain as everything else in his life, just quieter about it. And as she spoke, he saw the weight she had been carrying behind her. Calm, the strength it took to hold everything together while still making it look easy. And for the first time, he understood that she wasn't just someone who had found peace. She was someone who was choosing it every day, even when it was hard. And that realization deepened his feelings in a way that made everything more real, more complicated. Because now it wasn't just about what he wanted. It was about what she was going through too. About how his presence fit into a life that was already carrying its own struggles. And after that conversation, things didn't go back to how they were before. They became more honest, more open, but also more fragile. Was because now they both knew that the lives they were trying to build, separately and together, were not as stable as they had hoped. And that meant every decision mattered more. Every moment carried more weight. And the closer they grew, the more they risked losing. And one evening, as they sat together in the quiet, the tension between them finally found its way into words. Not through an argument, but through a question he hadn't planned to ask. He looked at her and asked what would happen if she had to let this place go, if everything she had built here was taken away, and the question hung in the air longer than expected. Because it wasn't just about the house, it was about everything it represented. And when she finally answered, her voice softer than usual, she said she didn't know who she would be without it. And that answer stayed with him because it mirrored something he had been feeling himself, the fear of losing not just a place, but a version of himself he had started to become. And in that moment, he realized that they were both standing on uncertain ground, both holding on to something they weren't sure they could keep. And that realization made everything between them feel both stronger and more fragile at the same time. Because now their connection wasn't just about comfort or escape. It was tied to real life, to real decisions, to real consequences. And as the night grew quieter and they went their separate ways, the weight of everything unspoken followed him back to his room, settling in his chest in a way that wouldn't let him rest. Because now there were too many questions, too many possibilities, so too many things that could go wrong. And for the first time since he arrived, he wondered if staying might actually lead to more pain than leaving ever could. And that thought lingered with him as he stared at the ceiling. The room no longer feeling as simple as it once had, because now it held something deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. And as that feeling grew, quiet but persistent, one question began to rise above all the others. If both of them were already standing on ground that could fall apart at any moment, what would happen when everything they were holding on to finally started to slip? Something shifted after that, not in a way that pulled them apart, but in a way that brought them closer with more awareness. Like they both understood now that what they had was not just a quiet escape, but something real. Is something that existed alongside the problems they hadn't solved yet. And instead of pretending those problems weren't there, they began to live with them, gently, carefully, choosing each other in small ways every day, without making promises they weren't ready to keep. And strangely, that made everything feel deeper, because it wasn't built on illusion anymore. It was built on truth, even if that truth was uncertain, and the days that followed became softer again, but not in the same way as before. This time there was intention behind everything, in the way he stayed longer in the kitchen just to be near her, in the way she would sit a little closer than usual during their quiet evenings, in the way their conversations carried more meaning even when they were about simple things, and slowly, without needing to define it, they stepped into something that felt like love, not loud or dramatic, but steady, warm and real. And it showed in the smallest moments, like the morning he woke up earlier than usual and found her outside trying to clear the snow on her own, her hands cold, her breath visible in the air. And without thinking, he joined her, taking the shovel from her gently. Not as a grand gesture, just as something natural, something that didn't need to be explained. And she didn't protest. She just watched him for a moment with a quiet look in her eyes that said more than words could. And later that day, when they sat together with cups of tea warming their hands, there was a kind of peace between them that felt earned, like something they had built together without even realizing it. And for a while, it seemed like that would be enough. Sounded like they could stay in that space a little longer, balancing everything without forcing a decision. But life doesn't stay still for long, and neither do feelings. And the deeper they went, the more everything else around them began to matter again. The past he hadn't fully faced, the future she wasn't sure she could hold on to, and those things didn't disappear just because they were finding something good together. They waited quietly for the right moment to be felt again, and that moment came sooner than either of them expected, on a night that started like any other. Calm, simple, almost too ordinary to carry anything heavy. They were sitting close, closer than they had ever been before. The kind of closeness that doesn't need permission anymore, just presence. And for the first time, there was no hesitation. No unspoken question between them, just a shared understanding that what they felt had grown into something neither of them could deny. And when he reached for her, it wasn't uncertain this time. It was clear, intentional, like a decision made without words, and she met him halfway, not cautiously, but fully. Like she had been waiting for that moment as much as he had, and everything that followed was quiet but powerful, not rushed, not overwhelming, just real, like two people finally allowing themselves to feel something they had been holding back. And for a while, the world outside didn't exist. The past didn't matter. The future didn't press in. There was only that moment, that connection, that feeling of being exactly where they were meant to be. And afterward, as they sat together in the stillness that follows something meaningful, there was a different kind of silence. Not empty, not uncertain, but full, like something had finally settled into place. And he realized then that this was no longer something temporary, no longer something he could walk away from easily, because now it wasn't just about staying in a place, it was about staying with her, about choosing her in a way that would change everything that came next. And that realization brought a kind of calm he hadn't felt before, because for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he wasn't trying to figure out where to go. He already knew where he wanted to be, and yet, underneath that calm, there was something else, something quieter but just as real. Because as much as he wanted to stay, as much as he felt like he had found something worth holding on to, he knew that nothing they were building existed in isolation. It was still connected to everything outside those walls, to the life he had left behind, to the pressures she was still facing, and those things hadn't disappeared. They had only been waiting, and as if on cue, reality found its way back in. Not gently this time, but suddenly, when the next morning arrived with something neither of them had expected, a letter placed carefully at the door, official, unavoidable, carrying news that would change everything for her. And as she opened it, her expression shifting in a way he had never seen before, the calm breaking just enough to reveal something deeper, something heavier. He felt that same tension return, stronger than before, because now it wasn't just his past that threatened what they had, it was her present too. Humorna, and as she stood there holding that letter, her hands still but her eyes filled with thoughts she hadn't spoken yet, he realized that whatever was written on that page had the power to take everything they had just begun to build and pull it apart before it even had the chance to fully become something. And in that moment, as silence filled the space between them again, heavier than it had ever been, one truth became impossible to ignore. They had just found something real, something worth fighting for, but they were about to find out if it could survive what was coming next. And the only question now was, what exactly had just entered their lives, and how much was it about to take from them? The kind that comes when you've been expecting something but still hoped it wouldn't arrive. And she told him in a calm voice that the property had been officially listed for sale by the lender, that she had been given a limited time to either buy it outright or leave, and the words landed slowly, each one settling into the space between them, making everything they had built feel suddenly uncertain. Because this place, the one thing that had held them together from the beginning, was no longer guaranteed. And for a moment, neither of them knew what to say, because there was no simple answer, no easy way to fix it, and the reality of it was clear. She might lose everything she had worked for, everything she had chosen when she walked away from her old life, and he might lose the only place that had started to feel like home again. And as that realization settled in, The quiet comfort they had found together began to feel fragile. Honea like something that could disappear if they didn't act. And for the rest of that day, things moved differently. Not slower, not calmer, but heavier, every moment carrying the awareness of what was at stake. And he saw it in her, in the way she kept moving, kept working, trying to maintain the same rhythm as before, even though something inside her had clearly shifted. And that made it harder for him to stay still, because now it wasn't just about his own uncertainty. It was about hers too, about what she was facing, about what they were both about to lose if nothing changed. And that night, when they finally sat down together, the silence between them wasn't comfortable anymore. It was filled with thoughts neither of them knew how to say out loud until he finally broke it, asking what she was going to do. And she gave a small, an honest answer, saying she didn't know yet, that she had options but none of them felt right, that staying would mean fighting for something she might not be able to keep, and leaving would mean letting go of something that had become part of who she was. And as she spoke, he could hear it, the conflict, the same kind he had been carrying, just in a different form. And it made him realize something he hadn't fully understood before, that they weren't just two people who had found each other by chance. They were two people standing at turning points in their lives at the same time, both forced to make choices they weren't ready for, and that connection made everything feel even more intense, because now their decisions weren't separate anymore. They were linked, even if they hadn't said it out loud yet. And over the next few days, that connection was tested in ways they hadn't experienced before, because the outside world didn't wait for them to figure things out. It kept moving, bringing new pressure, new questions, new realities they couldn't ignore. He started receiving more calls, more messages, opportunities that once would have meant everything to him, now feeling distant, almost irrelevant compared to what was happening here. And she began meeting with people, making calls of her own, trying to find a way to hold on to the place without losing herself in the process. And through all of it, they stayed close, supporting each other in small, steady ways. But there was a new kind of tension beneath it all, not between them, but around them, like the world was closing in, forcing them toward a decision they hadn't fully made yet. And one evening, after a long day of trying to solve problems that didn't seem to have easy solutions, they found themselves back in the same quiet room where everything had once felt simple. But this time, nothing about it felt simple anymore. And he looked at her, really looked at her, and realized how much he didn't want to lose this. Not the place, not the moments, not her. And before he could stop himself, he told her that maybe there was a way to fix it, that maybe they didn't have to let everything fall apart. And she listened, but there was something in her expression that made him pause, something cautious, something that wasn't fully ready to believe in solutions yet. And she asked him what he meant, and that question hung in the air, because he didn't have a clear answer. Not yet, just a feeling. So a desire to hold on to something he had just found. And as he tried to explain, he realized how complicated it was, how his own unfinished life could become part of the solution or part of the problem. And that was when it became clear, more than ever before, that whatever came next would require more than just feelings. It would require choices, real ones, the kind that change everything. And as they sat there, both aware of what was building between them and around them, the weight of those choices pressing in, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer, that staying here, staying with her, would mean letting go of something else completely. And for the first time, that trade felt real, unavoidable. And as the night grew quieter and the distance between what they wanted and what they could have became harder to ignore, and one question settled heavily between them, unspoken but impossible to avoid. If saving this place meant changing everything about the lives they had before, were they both ready to risk it all for something that had only just begun? Or would reality force them to walk away before they even had the chance to try? The idea of saving the place didn't leave him after that night. It stayed with him, growing quietly in the back of his mind until it became something he couldn't ignore, because the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only way forward, not just for her, but for them. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart in his own life, he felt a sense of direction again, a purpose that wasn't about fixing the past, but about building something new, something real, and that feeling pushed him to act. If even before he had fully figured out what it would mean, and over the next few days he began making calls, reaching out to people he had tried to avoid, stepping back into parts of his old life that still had influence, still had weight, and each time he did, it pulled him further away from the quiet world they had built together, even if only for a few hours at a time. And she noticed, of course she did, not in an accusing way, but in the way her eyes followed him a little longer when he stepped outside to take a call, in the way her questions became slightly more careful, like she was trying to understand what was happening without pushing too hard. And at first he tried to reassure her, telling her he was just exploring options, just trying to help. But even as he said it, he knew it was more than that. Because helping her meant stepping fully back into a world he had walked away from, a world that came with expectations, pressure, and pieces of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to pick up again. And that tension began to show, not loudly, not in arguments, but in small moments that didn't feel the same as before. Like the way their conversations would pause when his phone buzzed. Like the way he seemed distracted even when he was sitting right next to her. Like the way she would sometimes look at him like she was trying to figure out if he was still fully there. And one afternoon, that quiet tension finally found its way into words. Not through anger, but through honesty, because she asked him gently what he was really trying to do, not just for the place, but for himself, and the question caught him off guard. Oddly, because he hadn't separated those two things yet, in his mind, they were the same. Saving the place meant staying with her. Staying with her meant building something new, and building something new felt like the answer to everything he had lost. But when she asked it that way, it forced him to look deeper, to ask himself whether he was trying to help her or trying to fix himself through her. And that realization made things more complicated than he wanted them to be. And when he tried to explain, the words didn't come out as clearly as he had hoped, because feelings rarely do when they're still being understood. And she listened, but this time, her expression held something different, something more guarded, not because she didn't care, but because she did. Because she understood that if he was stepping back into his old life to save this one, then sooner or later, that old life would demand something from him again, something that might take him away. And that thought created a distance between them that neither of them had expected, because now it wasn't just about whether they could stay together. It was about whether the way he was trying to save things would actually pull them apart. And over the next few days, that distance grew, slowly but noticeably. Not because they stopped caring, but because they started thinking more, questioning more, feeling the weight of what was happening instead of just living in it. And he could feel it every time he left the room to take another call. Every time he returned and saw that slight hesitation in her eyes before she smiled. Every time the silence between them lasted a little longer than it used to, and it made him wonder if he was doing the right thing, if trying to fix everything was actually breaking the one thing he didn't want to lose. And yet stopping didn't feel like an option either, because doing nothing would mean watching everything fall apart, and he wasn't ready for that. Not after everything they had built, and that conflict pulled him in two directions at once, forward into action and backward into doubt. And it reached a breaking point one evening when he finally had something concrete, a real possibility, a deal that could save the place, but would require him to fully step back into his old world. Not temporarily, not halfway, but completely. And when he told her about it, the room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than anything before. Because this wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a decision waiting to be made. And she didn't react immediately. She just listened, taking in what it meant, not just for the place, but for them. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but steady. She asked him if he was sure this was what he wanted. Not for her, not for the house, but for himself. And that question hit harder than anything else, because the truth was, He didn't know anymore. He only knew that he didn't want to lose her, didn't want to lose this. And if stepping back into his old life was the price for keeping it, then maybe it was worth it. But as he stood there looking at her, waiting for her to say something, to agree, to believe in it the way he was trying to, he saw something in her eyes that stopped him, something quiet but clear, a hesitation. A fear not of losing the place, but of losing him in the process. And that was the moment everything shifted again, because now the question wasn't just whether they could save what they had, it was whether saving it would cost them more than they were ready to give. And as the silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying, one truth became impossible to ignore. Sometimes trying to hold on too tightly is the very thing that causes everything to slip away. And the only question left was, if he went through with this, would he still be the man she had started to fall for? Or would he become someone she no longer recognized? The distance didn't happen all at once. It grew quietly, like something neither of them wanted to name, but both of them could feel. And even though they were still in the same space, Asha still moving through the same rooms, still sharing the same routines, it no longer felt the same because now every moment carried a question underneath it, a quiet uncertainty about what would happen next. And he felt it most in the small things, in the way she no longer lingered as long in the kitchen when he was there, in the way their conversations stayed on the surface instead of going deeper, in the way silence had changed from something comforting into something that felt like distance. And he told himself it was temporary, that once everything was sorted out, once the decision was made, things would go back to how they were. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true because something had already shifted, something that couldn't simply be undone. And the more he moved forward with his plan, the more that shift became real. Because now there were meetings, calls that lasted longer, moments where he was physically present but mentally somewhere else. And each time it happened, he could see it in her. Not anger, not frustration, just a quiet pulling back, like she was protecting something inside herself, something she wasn't ready to lose again. And that hurt him in a way he hadn't expected, because he wasn't trying to drift away from her. He was trying to hold on, but somehow the way he was doing it was creating the very distance he was afraid of. And that realization sat heavy with him, growing stronger with each passing day until it became impossible to ignore. And one evening, after another long call that kept him outside longer than he had intended, he came back in and found her sitting alone, the room quiet, the lights dim, and for a moment, he just stood there watching her, realizing how far apart they felt even in the same space. And when she looked up at him, there was no accusation in her eyes, just something softer, something more final, like she had already accepted something he was still trying to change. And that was when he knew they couldn't keep avoiding it anymore, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. So he sat down across from her, the space between them feeling wider than it had ever been, and he told her that he didn't want to lose this, didn't want to lose her, that everything he was doing was for them, for a chance to keep what they had. And as he spoke, he could hear how much he meant it, how real it was to him. But when he finished, the silence that followed told him that it wasn't that simple. And when she finally responded, her voice calm but heavy with truth, she told him that she knew he meant well, that she knew he cared, but that somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeling like them and started feeling like something he was trying to control, something he was trying to fix instead of feel. And those words hit harder than he expected, because they forced him to see what he hadn't wanted to admit, that in trying to protect what they had, he had started to change the very thing that made it special. And for a moment, he didn't know how to respond, because he couldn't fully argue with her, couldn't fully deny it either. And that was when the truth began to settle in, slowly but clearly, that maybe what they were facing wasn't just about external problems or difficult choices. Maybe it was about something deeper, something within both of them that needed to be understood before anything could be saved. And as that realization grew, So did the distance between what they wanted and what they were actually experiencing, and for the first time since everything had begun, he felt the possibility of losing her. Not as a distant fear, but as something real, something close, something that could happen if they didn't find a way back to each other. And that fear pushed him to say something he hadn't planned, something that came from a place of urgency rather than clarity. He told her that he could stop, that he could walk away from the deal, from everything he had started, if that was what it took to fix this, to bring them back to what they had before. And the moment the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't as simple as they sounded. Because it wasn't just about stopping, it was about undoing everything he had set in motion, about choosing her over everything else without fully understanding what that meant. And she heard it too, not just the words, but the weight behind them. And instead of looking relieved, instead of accepting it the way he thought she might, she looked at him with a quiet sadness that said more than any answer could. And she told him that it wasn't about him stopping or continuing. It was about whether what they had could survive being turned into a choice like that at all. And that was the moment everything became clear in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. Because love, the kind they had started to build, wasn't meant to feel like a trade, wasn't meant to be something you sacrifice everything else for without understanding it first. And yet, here they were, standing at that exact point, forced to choose in a way that didn't feel right no matter which direction they looked. And as the silence settled between them again, heavier than before, he realized that there was no easy answer left, no simple way to fix what was happening. And for the first time since he arrived, staying didn't feel certain anymore. It felt just as fragile as leaving. And that realization stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Long after the house fell quiet again, because now the question wasn't just about what he was willing to do to keep her. It was about whether what they had was strong enough to survive the way everything was unfolding. And as he lay awake that night, staring into the dark, feeling the weight of everything they had said and everything they hadn't, one thought refused to let him rest. What if trying to save this love was the very thing that would end up breaking it? And if that was true, then the real question wasn't what he should do next, but whether there was still time to stop before they lost each other completely. The next morning didn't bring clarity, it brought distance. The kind that settles quietly after something important has been said and can't be taken back. And even though nothing had ended between them, it felt like something had paused, like they were both standing still, waiting to see what would happen next without knowing how to move forward. And he felt it the moment he stepped out of his room and didn't hear the usual sounds from the kitchen. No soft movement, no quiet rhythm of her starting the day, just silence. And when he finally found her, she was already dressed, already moving, but there was something different in the way she carried herself, more contained, more careful, like she was holding something in place that might fall apart if she let it slip even a little. And he wanted to say something, to fix it, to return them to the way things were. But the truth was, he didn't know how, because what had changed wasn't just the situation. It was the understanding between them, the realization that what they had was now tied to decisions they couldn't avoid anymore. And so instead of trying to force the moment, he stayed quiet, letting the morning pass in a way that felt unfamiliar and heavy. And as the day unfolded, that quiet turned into something more reflective, more inward, because for the first time since all of this began, he stopped trying to act and started trying to understand, not just what he wanted, but why he wanted it. And that shift changed everything, because it forced him to see the truth he had been avoiding, that he had been trying to hold on to her the same way he used to hold on to everything else in his life, tightly, urgently, as if control was the only way to keep something from slipping away. And that realization didn't come with immediate answers. It came with discomfort, with the slow recognition that maybe the way he loved needed to change if he wanted it to last. And as he sat with that thought, letting it settle instead of pushing it away, something inside him began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make him see things differently. And later that afternoon, when he finally spoke to her again, it wasn't from a place of urgency. It wasn't about fixing anything. It was about being honest. And he told her that he didn't have all the answers, that he didn't know exactly what the right decision was yet, but that he was starting to understand that whatever they had couldn't be built on pressure or fear, that it had to come from something steadier than that. And as he spoke, he could feel the difference in himself. The way the words came more slowly, more carefully, not trying to convince, just trying to be true. And she listened, really listened, the same way she always had. But this time, there was something else in her expression, something softer, something that suggested she could see the change in him, even if she wasn't ready to respond to it yet. And when he finished, she didn't give him an immediate answer. Didn't tell him what she was thinking or what she felt. She just nodded slightly, like she was taking it in, like she needed time to let it settle the same way he had. And for a moment, that felt like progress. Not a solution, not a resolution, but a step, something small but real. And for the rest of the day, things felt quieter in a different way. Not distant, not tense, just slower, more thoughtful, like they were both trying to move carefully instead of rushing towards something they didn't fully understand yet. And that shift stayed with him into the evening, into the night, until he found himself alone again, sitting with his thoughts. But this time, they weren't pulling him in different directions. They were guiding him towards something clearer, something he hadn't fully allowed himself to consider before. And that was the possibility that the answer wasn't about choosing between his past and his present, or between staying and leaving, but about choosing who he wanted to be moving forward, regardless of where that led him. And that idea felt both freeing and terrifying, because it meant letting go of control, letting go of certainty, trusting something he couldn't fully see yet. And as he sat there, letting that realization settle, something else followed it, something even harder to ignore. The understanding that even if he changed, even if he made the right choice for himself, it didn't guarantee that she would still choose him. And that was the part he hadn't been ready to face before. The part that made everything feel real in a way that couldn't be softened or avoided. And yet, for the first time, swore he didn't try to run from that thought. He stayed with it, accepted it, because he knew now that love wasn't about holding on at any cost. It was about being willing to risk loss without losing yourself in the process. And that realization brought a quiet kind of strength he hadn't felt before. Not loud, not certain, but steady enough to carry him into whatever came next. And the next morning, when he woke up, there was a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in days. Not because everything was solved, but because he knew what he needed to do, not for her, not for the place, but for himself. And that clarity stayed with him as he got up, as he walked downstairs, as he saw her standing there. The same space between them, but something different in the air. Something that felt like the beginning of an answer, rather than the end of a question. And as he looked at her, really looked at her, he realized that whatever came next would change everything. Not just for him, but for both of them. And for a moment, time seemed to pause, like the world was waiting for him to take the next step, to say the words he had finally found. And as he opened his mouth to speak, the weight of that moment settled in fully, because this wasn't just another conversation. This was the turning point, the moment where everything would either come together or fall apart completely. And the only thing left uncertain was not what he would say, but how she would respond, because no matter how clear he had become, no matter how ready he felt, one truth remained. The future he was about to step into depended not only on his choice, but on whether she was still willing to be part of it. And as that realization filled the space between them, quiet but powerful, one final question rose to the surface. After everything they had been through, everything they had built and almost lost, would this moment bring them back together, or would it be the one that finally pulled them apart for good? He didn't rush the moment, even though everything inside him wanted to, because for the first time, he understood that what he was about to say needed to come from truth, not fear, not urgency, not the need to fix something, but from a place that was steady enough to hold whatever came next. And so he stood there for a second longer than expected, letting the silence settle, letting his thoughts align with what he had finally come to understand. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had accepted that fear was part of this, part of loving something real. And he told her that he had been trying to hold on in the wrong way, that he had been treating what they had like something that needed to be secured, protected, controlled, instead of something that needed to be lived, trusted, and allowed to grow on its own. And as he said it, he could feel the truth of it in a way that didn't need to be explained further. Because it wasn't just about her, it was about who he had been before, the way he had approached everything in his life, always trying to stay ahead, always trying to make sure nothing could slip away, and how that way of living had eventually led him to lose everything anyway. And this time, he didn't want to repeat that pattern, not with her, not with something that actually mattered. And so he told her that he wasn't going to move forward with the deal, not because he thought it would fix things between them, but because it didn't feel right for who he was becoming, that stepping back into that world in that way would mean losing something inside himself that he had only just started to understand. And he didn't want to build a future, any future, on something that didn't feel true, and the words didn't come out perfectly. They weren't polished or carefully structured, but they were honest. And for the first time, that felt like enough. And when he finished, he didn't add anything else, didn't try to convince her or fill the silence that followed. He just stayed there, letting the moment be what it was, letting her take it in the way she needed to. And for a few seconds, nothing happened. No reaction, with no immediate response, just quiet. And then slowly, something in her expression softened. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to show that she had heard him, really heard him, and that what he had said mattered. And she stepped a little closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to shift it. And when she spoke, her voice carried something different this time, something more open, more vulnerable. And she told him that she had been afraid, not of losing the place, not even of the uncertainty ahead, but of losing the version of him she had started to care about, the one who had shown up quietly without expectations, the one who had learned how to be present instead of in control. And when she saw him slipping back into his old world, even for the right reasons, it felt like watching that version of him disappear. And she didn't know if what they had could survive that. And hearing that made everything clearer because it showed him exactly what had been at stake. Not just the relationship, but the person he was becoming within it. And for a moment they stood there closer now, the distance between them no longer as wide, but not completely gone either. Because even though something had shifted, something had been understood. There were still questions left, still things that needed time. And when he reached for her hand this time, it wasn't out of urgency or fear. It was out of something quieter, something steadier. And she didn't pull away, but she didn't hold on tightly either. She just let their hands rest together, like she was still deciding, still feeling, still trying to understand what this new version of them would look like. And that was when the truth settled in fully, that this moment wasn't the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of something more honest, something that would require both of them to choose each other not just once, but again and again, without guarantees, without certainty. And that kind of love didn't come with immediate resolution. It came with time, with patience, with the willingness to stay even when things weren't fully clear. And as the day moved forward, they didn't rush into answers, didn't try to define what they were or what would happen next. They just stayed in that space, allowing things to unfold naturally. And for the first time in a while, it felt like they were moving in the same direction again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to feel like they hadn't lost each other after all. And yet, beneath that quiet progress, there was still something unresolved, something neither of them had fully faced yet. Because even though he had stepped away from the deal, even though she had opened herself back up to the possibility of them, the reality of her situation hadn't changed. The letter was still real. The time limit was still approaching, and the future of the place that had brought them together in the first place, was still uncertain. And that truth lingered quietly in the background, waiting, And as evening came, and they found themselves once again sitting in the same space that had held so many versions of their story, he realized that they had made it through one turning point, but another one was already ahead of them, one that wouldn't be solved by words or understanding alone. And as he looked at her hand still resting lightly in his, her eyes softer but still carrying that quiet strength he had come to admire, one thought settled deeply into his mind. Choosing each other was only the first step, but what came next would determine whether they could actually build a life together, or whether this would remain something beautiful but temporary. And as that thought took hold, steady and unavoidable, the question that followed it felt even heavier. When the time finally came to face the reality they could no longer delay, would choosing each other be enough to keep them together, or would the life waiting outside those walls still find a way to pull them apart? The days that followed didn't feel rushed anymore, but they didn't feel easy either. They felt real, like everything had finally settled into the truth of what it was. No more pretending, no more avoiding, just two people standing in the middle of something meaningful, trying to see if it could actually last beyond the walls that had protected it for so long. And for the first time, they didn't try to escape the reality waiting for them. They faced it together, slowly, carefully, like something fragile that needed to be handled with honesty instead of fear. And he stayed present in a way he hadn't before. Not distracted, not divided, just there, fully, with her, through the conversations, through the uncertainty, through the quiet moments where neither of them spoke, but both of them understood what was at stake. And she let him in more too, not just into her space, but into her decisions, into the things she had been carrying alone for so long. And together they started to look at the situation not as something to run from, but as something to walk through, step by step, even if they didn't know where it would lead. And there were moments of hope, small ones, like when they found possible options, ideas that might buy them time, ways the place could be saved without losing everything else in the process. And in those moments, it felt like maybe, just maybe, things would work out, that they would find a way to keep both the place and what they had built together. But life doesn't move in straight lines, and for every small step forward, there were reminders of how uncertain everything still was. Deadlines getting closer, decisions needing to be made, and as those pressures built, so did the weight of what they were trying to hold on to. And yet, something about them had changed enough to carry it differently. They didn't break under it. They didn't turn away from each other. They stayed even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was unclear. And that alone felt like progress, like something worth holding on to. And then the day came, the one they both knew was approaching, but hadn't fully allowed themselves to feel until it was right in front of them. The final decision about the place, the moment where everything would either continue or come to an end. And that morning felt different from the start. Quieter than usual, not heavy, not tense, just still. Like the world itself was waiting, and as they stood together in that familiar space, the one that had held the beginning of everything between them, there was no need for long conversations or explanations. Because everything that needed to be said had already been said in the days before. And when the call finally came, when the answer they had been waiting for was spoken out loud, it didn't come with relief or heartbreak in a way either of them expected. It came with something else, something more grounded, more real, because regardless of what happened to the place, something inside both of them had already shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. And when they looked at each other after the call ended, there was no panic, no rush to react, just a quiet understanding that whatever came next, they would face it as the people they had become, not the ones they had been when this all started. And in that moment, standing there together with the future no longer something distant, but something right in front of them, he realized that this had never really been about the place, not entirely. It had been about finding something real when everything else had fallen apart, about learning how to stay instead of run, about discovering that sometimes the most important thing you can hold on to isn't a place or a plan, but a person, and the version of yourself that exists when you're with them. And as that realization settled in, calm and steady, he reached for her hand again, not because he was afraid of losing her, but because he wanted to walk forward with her, whatever that meant. And this time, she held on fully, not cautiously, not halfway, but with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. And for a moment, everything felt clear, not in the sense that all their problems were solved, but in the sense that they were no longer facing them alone. And that was enough, more than enough. And as they stood there, the world outside beginning to shift with the early signs of spring, the snow slowly melting, the air changing, it felt like something inside them was changing too. Something that had been frozen now starting to move again. And yet, even in that clarity, even in that quiet sense of togetherness, there was still one truth they couldn't ignore. That life beyond this moment would test them in ways they couldn't predict, that staying together here, in this space, was one thing. But building a life together beyond it was something else entirely. Something that would require more than just feelings, more than just understanding. It would require choice again and again, in ways they hadn't experienced yet. And as that thought settled in, not as fear but as awareness, or he realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a different one that didn't promise perfection, but offered something more real than that, something they would have to continue choosing every day. And as they stepped forward together, leaving behind the version of this place that had held them at the beginning, moving into whatever came next, one quiet question lingered in the space between them. Not heavy, not uncertain, just real. When the world outside finally tested what they had built inside these walls, would their love grow stronger with each challenge, or would it slowly fade once the place that brought them together was no longer there to hold it in place? And that was the part of the story that had yet to be written. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe and become part of this journey. Because here we tell stories about love, second chances, and the moments that change everything. Like this video if you believe love can find you when you least expect it. Comment below. Would you have stayed or would you have walked away? And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story, because the next one might be even more unforgettable.